Imagine for a second a parent who only follows through on the good threats. You clean up, you get dessert. You get A's on your report card, we're going to Disneyland. If you practice your instrument for 30 minutes a day for a week, I'll give you $30. Now, it's important, don't do the wage math on that. I don't think that's quite minimum wage. But then the kid does not follow through, and that parent still rewards them anyway. So in this scenario, imagine if there is never any correction or any consequences to bad actions. Further, imagine if there are corrective threats that are never followed through on. Now, what would the outcome be? You're going to get a kid who is whiny, out of control, no boundaries, spoiled, right? We know this. Now, I've had people in my life who want me to hold them accountable to goals of some kind. And my question every time I'm asked is, what do you want me to do if you don't follow through? With no consequences, there are no change. Now, conversely, you don't want a parent who only follows through on the bad threats either. We all know that the best parents, they reward and they correct. Now, funny enough, when God says, "Call me Father," we're like, great, I love it. Except our actions tend to indicate that we really don't want a dad, we want a benefactor. See, when God gives us something good, it's a blessing. And when God gives us something difficult, we ask, God, where are you at? Now, we're in the second week of our Babylon My Home series, which is a study in the book of Daniel. And we're starting this book this week. Last week, we just looked at God's preparation for them to be exiled from Jerusalem to Babylon. And what does this even mean? Well, I feel a need to just repeat a little bit. In Leviticus chapter 26, God has Moses write this. It says, "If you follow my decrees and are careful to obey my commands," and then he gives a big list. He's like, I'm going to send the rains. Your farms are going to produce tons of crops. You're going to have plenty of food for yourselves. You'll be safe. Militarily, you'll never have to worry. Wild animals, they won't be a threat. This is my favorite part. It actually says in there, you're going to be able to sleep well, right? Like you'll be able to sleep. We all want that. Keeps going. It's like you're going to have tons of kids. You're going to be happy. I'll be happy. Our relationship will be strong. And that goes all the way from 26:3 to 26:13. And then in verse 14 of Leviticus 26, it says, "However, if you do not listen to me or obey all these commands," and then that list reads like, hey, remember all that other stuff? Well, just opposite that. Your health is going to fail. Nature's going to feel like it's against you. You're going to lose battles. You're going to be paranoid about who else wants to beat you in battle, and much, much more. Now, just a few notes on this. This was God's promise to Israel. He wasn't making this with anyone else, us included. Do I believe that good things happen and go well for people who honor God? Yeah, and sometimes that's supernatural, but sometimes just cause and effect. And do I believe that things do not go well for people groups who dishonor God? Well, yeah, I mean, it does happen sometimes supernaturally, sometimes just through cause and effect, except sometimes things go well for those who don't honor God and vice versa. As I pointed out last week, God was incredibly patient with Israel. I mean, there are consequences, but they get a lot of opportunities to do the right thing. And here was another consequence of failing to do the right thing. In Leviticus 26:33, it says, "I will scatter you among the nations and bring out my sword against you. Your land will become desolate and your cities will lie in ruins." Now, this is incredibly significant because Daniel chapter 1, verse 1 starts like this. "During the 3rd year of King Jehoiakim's reign in Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave him victory over King Jehoiakim and permitted him to take some of the sacred objects from the temple of God. So Nebuchadnezzar took them back to the land of Babylonia and placed them in the treasure house of his God." Now, 2,600 years later, nobody bats an eye at this analysis. And the reason why is because we are not that familiar with ancient Mesopotamian military prowess. It's just not really most of our forte. But Nebuchadnezzar II was one of the greatest leaders in world history. Babylon was the superpower of its day. During his reign, 10% of the world's population called him their emperor. He built the Hanging Gardens, which is one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world. He blazed a trail that would be repeated by several coming superpowers after him. And what we get in Daniel chapter 1 is this description: the Lord gave him victory. Imagine this analysis for a second. NBA champion Denver Nuggets fortunate to win against University City High School Centurions. Nikola Jokic only scores 1 million points, right? No way, right? You wouldn't respect this take. The NBA champions are infinitely better than any high school team on the planet. Now, why do I bring this up? Because an audacious faith in God recognizes our feelings and logic are secondary to God's wisdom. See, as a reasoned, rational man, it does not feel like we needed God's involvement in this. Nebuchadnezzar was clearly superior in his might. However, the picture of God as all-powerful, all-knowing, and sovereign, or in other words, in control, lets us know nothing escapes his sight. See, Nebuchadnezzar was powerful and he was victorious because God positioned him, allowed him, and orchestrated him to be. There is nothing within the universe outside of God's jurisdiction. He's never powerless to intervene. And this creates a million other questions and tangents, but any level of peace within the chaos of life starts with acknowledging God is in control. Now, the alternative is feeling tossed and turned in the unrelenting waves of a storm you cannot master. See, another perspective to maintain is this: God is faithful in the excess and the famine. See, God fulfilled his promise to discipline the Israelites, and whether you like that promise or not is irrelevant. God is not a parent who just negligently allows his kids to tantrum without any consequence. I know, there's a lot of hope in this today, right? Now, you'll also notice that God permitted Nebuchadnezzar to remove the sacred objects. Now, this might not seem like a big deal, but in the ancient world, this was huge. See, people saw battles between nations as battles between their deities. So when Babylon defeats Judah, in their eyes, they see Marduk, the Babylonian god, is defeating Yahweh, or the Israelite God. See, God permits the Babylonians to remove the sacred objects. Or in other words, God allows himself to be humiliated before the eyes of the world. See, God's love for his people means he is willing to be shamed if it wakes them up. This is humility. He's not so insecure that he feels threatened by this action. See, God certainly didn't earn this treatment, but he is willing to endure it if it means his kids start to adjust. Now, the story keeps going in Daniel chapter 1, and starting in verse 3. It says, the king ordered Ashpenaz, his chief of staff, to bring to the palace some of the young men of Judah's royal family and other noble families who had been brought to Babylon as captives. Now, he tells them, select only strong, healthy, and good-looking young men, he said. Make sure they are well-versed in every branch of learning and gifted with knowledge and good judgment and are suited to serve in the royal palace. Train these young men in the language and literature of Babylon. And the king assigned them a daily ration of food and wine from his own kitchens, and they were to be trained for 3 years, and then they would enter the royal service. This is a brilliant strategy. Pick the best. Pick the brightest. Don't put them in prison or kill them to make them martyrs, but instead give them positions of prestige. Let them sleep in the best rooms, eat the best foods, wear the finest clothes. Let them grow to be advisors in the most powerful room in the world. And this is how Babylon becomes so powerful. See, they conquered, but then they offered a seduction to those who would have led the rebellion had they let them. It keeps going. It says in verse 6, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were 4 of the young men chosen, all from the tribe of Judah. The chief of staff renamed them with these Babylonian names. Daniel was called Belteshazzar, Hananiah was called Shadrach, Mishael was called Meshach, and Azariah was called Abednego. Here's the Babylonian brainwashing strategy. We will isolate you, we will incentivize you, we will educate you, and we will rename you. But I know, this doesn't mean anything to you, right? Because you're not conquered, you're not living in Babylon, you're good, right? This is actually the same strategy being used on us. Let's just assume for a second you want to be a solid follower of Jesus. I'm not talking like a missionary or a monk, just regular faithfulness. Well, if that's you, there is a temptation to isolate. Some of it is obvious. The average church attendance right now is 1.4 times a month for people who regularly go to church. Just to be clear, I don't think that perfect, attendance is mandatory. But, after a little bit of time, church becomes to feel a lot more optional. But sometimes it's not so overt. Sometimes it's subtle. Like when you are in an environment with other people who are Jesus followers, you're like, I'm not going to share. I'm not going to open up. I'm not going to ask for prayer. I'm going to live in my pain, and I'm therefore motivated by shame and guilt rather than victory. You're living in isolation. But you're not just living in isolation. You're also incentivized to go along with the brainwashing. You're the weird guy if you don't laugh at the jokes, if you don't share the gossip, or make the same choices as other people around you. And frankly, if you go along with it, you seemingly have more fun, you have more friends, you make more money just to go with the flow with everybody else. You're being incentivized. Not only that, though, you are being indoctrinated daily. Now, is this where I rail against public education? I don't know, maybe. It just depends on what they're saying. But when it says, train these young men in the language and the literature of Babylon, what this means is astrology, religious practices, and I want to be very clear, I doubt that you're being indoctrinated religiously like that. But my question to you is, what do you call entertainment? How is that reshaping what you think is permissible in your own life? What you think is normal? When you watch TV, social media, etc., like you are being educated. And then also your identity is under assault. See, each name of Daniel and his friends means something that honors God initially. And each of their new names is now closely tied to Babylonian gods. So for you, what does God call you? He calls you chosen, loved, accepted, son, daughter, victorious, holy. And how are you being labeled? Sometimes our labels are willingly taken of successful, attractive. Sometimes they're negative and depressed, alone, unlovely. But we start accepting these other labels on ourselves, and we remove how God sees us to accept how other people would label us and therefore change our identity. And what we're going to see over this year is Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah have the ability to live within the system while not succumbing to it. See, at some point, we all want to be an idealist, and I get it. Idealism gets you a lot of clicks, but in our society, it's pragmatism that actually really pays your bills. Or in other words, you probably want me to passionately say, it's better to allow yourself to die than be seduced by the Babylonians. But that's not what these four guys do. See, we kind of forget that we actually know Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's actual Jewish names. But we're also not encouraged to just go along with it either. So what do we take away from this? Well, the first is this: you're more likely to win if you know your enemy's strategy. See, pay attention to what you can see. As we will find out next week, work around what you can, but work within what you have to. See, when you're in exile, know that the God who got you in can get you out. See, the hard part about acknowledging God's sovereignty is knowing that He allowed this. But the encouraging part is knowing it's under His control and He can get you out. He is our Father, and He does not give you a rock when you ask for bread or a snake when you ask for a fish. And that's Jesus' quote, by the way. I'm not just like on some really weird illustration kick. What I'm saying is our Father isn't deaf. He listens and He changes things. Now further, you can trust a God who is willing to be shamed for you. See, in this Old Testament story, it's allowing the vessels to be transported from the temple to the Babylonian gods' storehouse. But in the New Testament, it's allowing His Son to be humiliated and shamed by dying a criminal's death. See, our entire relationship with God and discipline is different because of the cross. Jesus paid it all on Mount Calvary. His bruises and the holes in His hands are the receipts. And God will still lovingly discipline us. Hebrews chapter 12 makes this abundantly clear. However, you can sit in a seat of privilege. See, Daniel and his friends didn't. See, on this side of the empty grave, we are not under the law. And in my experience, God's reversals and rescues, they usually come a lot faster here. And even when they don't, because sometimes they don't happen, his grace is sufficient in your time of need. See, next week we're going to continue this story of how Daniel thrives in Babylon. But I want to pray for you because I believe that some of you need to take a next step today, that you can trust God in the good and the bad. I know that some of you need to take a next step today that you're going to look out for where you are trying to be brainwashed. But no matter what your next step is, I want to encourage you to take it. So let me pray for you. God, thank you for your grace, which is sufficient in the best of circumstances and the worst. I'm praying for those who need to recognize where they are trying to be brainwashed by the enemy. The God, that they would stop calling things entertainment that are actually reshaping the way that they think. The God, that they would reject the labels being thrust upon them by an outside world. The God, that they would be wholly devoted to you. But at the same time, God, I'm praying that they would have the wisdom to know what things they can change and what things they can't. God, I'm also thanking you for being the type of God who is willing to shame yourself if that meant saving us. God, I pray that we would all experience that level of grace and that level of intentional love that you have sent towards us by sacrificing your own Son on our behalf. And so, Lord, I pray this all in your Son, Jesus' name. Amen. Hey, join us next week as we continue in this series. We're going to talk about how Daniel, Hananiah, Ashrael, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, all those guys, how they were able to rise to the top even when they were being forced to do things that were probably against God's plan for people in general. So you're going to love it. It's going to be a great sermon. I'm looking forward to telling you about that next week.